Most people have heard of the Apostle Peter, at the very least because of jokes about St. Peter guarding the gates of heaven. We have pictures, cartoons, jokes about him at the pearly gates welcoming people in, presumably because in Matthew 16, after Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah, the Lord says, "I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven." Bible readers know Peter had a prominent place among the 12 apostles. Even so, the letters assigned to Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter, have long held a rather modest place in biblical studies. Sometimes it seems we have robbed Peter to pay Paul. One scholar who has written extensively on 1 Peter, John Hall Elliott, referred to the letter as an exegetical stepchild. Yet, Martin Luther, who freely disparaged the letter of James, calling it an epistle of straw, considered 1 Peter to be, as he put it, one of the grandest epistles of the New Testament. But despite the relative disinterest in 1 Peter at various points in church history, the letter served as a source of encouragement as well as challenge, especially to Christians facing persecution in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries. For example, the early Christian authors Clement of Rome, the late 1st century, and Polycarp of Smyrna in the 2nd century, they found inspiration and consolation from 1 Peter. 1 Peter is an encyclical letter addressed to churches in 5 provinces in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. In the early 2nd century, Trajan was the emperor of the Roman Empire, and Pliny the Younger was governor of Pontus and Bithynia, 2 of the provinces that received Peter's letter. Governor Pliny wrote a letter to Trajan the emperor describing the governor's practice of interrogating and persecuting Christians. That letter was written not many years after 1 Peter was written. So we can see how 1 Peter might have served to encourage the Christians under Pliny and Trajan to hold on to their faith despite painful opposition. Now, we'll talk more about Peter and his authorship of the letter when we get into the first few verses of the letter itself. But a couple of things that struck me right away studying 1 Peter was his heavy dependence upon the Old Testament and the frequent use of rare words. Now, we need not draw any particular deep theological significance from his rare vocabulary, but his use of the Old Testament is theologically important. Peter uses the Old Testament to draw his readers into the story of God, which is a story of deliverance, a story of redemption, a story of divine love. There are many places where Peter places his readers within the story of God, starting with his use of the term elect. Elect is an allusion to God's election of Israel. Peter also demonstrates that the Christian community is to be a united people of God, not merely a group of individuals with similar beliefs. As the united people of God, they stand in solidarity with all sisters and brothers, even when oppressed by naysayers and devilish detractors. The united people of God must not compromise, even to alleviate the conditions under which they struggle to survive. One of the major themes of 1 Peter is that of suffering. The letter itself does not emphasize violent attack. However, it does liken the alienation, the shame, the slander, and other abuses to being burned with fire, to like being in a crucible. And Peter's readers, they lived in a place and time where honor and shame functioned as key elements of the culture. And it's likely that the Christians faced verbal abuse and other actions designed to shame them, to demean them, to discredit their witness as followers of Jesus, to think of them as people who endangered the common good. Such public shaming served as pressure to get these believers to conform to the values and behavior of the larger society. Peter's words now serve as an encouragement to keep his readers from becoming demoralized, from becoming discouraged, from even possibly giving up on their faith. At various points in the written commentary, I point to different groups who have faced marginalization because they provide poignant, real-life illustrations of what Peter's first readers were experiencing. Perhaps you are a descendant of Africans who were enslaved in the so-called New World, and you are aware of the humiliation and degradation our people face for centuries. Many of these people found faith in Jesus and have become our teachers. They teach us what it means to suffer and yet still have hope. When I teach on 1 Peter, I often talk about my own great aunt who grew up in the South and was part of what's called the Great Migration of African Americans who moved up from the South toward the North when the tensions got really strong in the South and they looked for more hope in the North. She was someone who worked as a domestic for other people, cooking, cleaning. I once talked to her about this, and she said, "Dennis, don't you know all the females," that was her word, "all the females in your family worked as domestics for white people." Yet when she died, and when her life was celebrated, many people pointed out that despite the suffering that she had endured for years, and the marginalization of being a woman and being African American and from the South, she exemplified the way of Christ in a way that became a light and a magnet even to other people. She had learned to have faith in the midst of suffering. That's part of the message of 1 Peter. Perhaps you are yourself an immigrant or a descendant of immigrants. You may well know how difficult it was to come to a new place, be unfamiliar with local customs, as well as a new language. There's a sense of disorientation, a lack of familiarity that creates distance from the dominant culture. Well, immigrants, as well as the offspring of slaves, they demonstrate what it means to be aliens and foreigners with regard to the dominant culture. The first readers of this letter, 1 Peter, may not have been literally aliens or foreigners from a geographical standpoint, but they were surely treated like outsiders, the way the descendants of slaves or immigrants in our time have been. As outsiders, Peter's readers needed to know that God had not abandoned them. They needed to know that they were part of the people of God, God's elect, as it were. They needed to know that they were walking in the footsteps of Jesus, who was also marginalized, who also suffered, yet remained faithful, and subsequently was given a place of honor. Those who suffer in the name of Jesus, who are ostracized and marginalized, yet remain faithful, will not be put to shame, but will also receive a place of honor. Another theme that Peter stresses is that of holiness. And he does this by using words associated with the Greek word hagios, translated holy or sanctified. Peter also focuses on Christian conduct that might serve as a witness to unbelievers. Peter cites Leviticus 19, "Be holy, because I am holy," and that sets the tone for subsequent admonitions. Now, holiness is more than merely a list of things to avoid. It is fundamentally devotion to God, and that devotion results in a qualitatively different perspective on life than one may have had prior to conversion. We'll talk about holiness more as we get into this study, but as I said, holiness is a qualitative difference in life. We often think of it quantitatively, like the things we can measure, behaviors we can sort of list. Well, we'll see that Peter will treat holiness as a qualitative aspect of life, how one is related to God, which will then result in actions one might perform or might avoid. In light of the qualitative differences in life, Peter does offer some specific attitudes and actions that these attitudes and actions would enhance communal life. They would help the Christians reflect different values from those of the dominant unbelieving culture. The religious background of that dominant culture is often referred to as pagan. That's how the NIV typically translates the Greek word ethnos, or Gentile, in 1 Peter. So paganism, in this ancient context, It gets at the diversity of religious practices in Greco-Roman society. And those practices would include emperor worship. Those practices would have already been offensive to Jews. But to those who became followers of Jesus apart from Judaism, Gentile converts, they needed to be encouraged to stay away from old behaviors and to start the practice of new ones. Along with suffering and holiness, salvation is another important topic for Peter, and it's related to other theological concepts such as Christology, how we see Christ, how we see Christ's divinity, his eternality. It's also related to eschatology, the study of the end times. First Peter opens with teaching on salvation, with 3 of the 4 occurrences of the word salvation appearing in the first chapter alone. Salvation begins with new birth, but finds its culmination in the future. Jesus is the one who makes salvation possible through his death and resurrection, and it's upon his return that salvation will be made complete. First Peter does not only speak to ancient times, when Christians suffered severe persecution. It also speaks to our contemporary context, even in the Western Hemisphere. There are some Christians today who lament the loss of social hegemony that Christianity once enjoyed. They view this loss as a form of persecution. It may be that First Peter has something to say to those who fear that Christians have become marginalized even in the West. Peter has something to teach Christians who may be concerned about the possibility of losing influence in society, and he reminds us that there are sisters and brothers throughout the world, even today, who are suffering severely because of their faith, including some who are being martyred. These believers, they serve as models and teachers for us because they make graphic the lessons of 1 Peter. Now, even as I note the individual themes that emerge from reading 1 Peter, I hasten to add that foundational to everything, including Peter's use of the Old Testament, is the person and the ministry of Jesus Christ. Those themes of suffering, holiness, and salvation, they derive their significance from the life of Jesus. Numerous references Peter gives to the life, to the suffering, the death, and resurrection of Jesus, and they serve as a basis for Christian belief and behavior. The Lord continually serves as a model for the community. 1 Peter follows the typical format of ancient Greco-Roman letters. It's a brief outline. The opening greeting, chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Now, letters during the New Testament era in the Greco-Roman world, they included an opening where the sender would send greetings to the recipients, often followed by a remembrance or a wish for the recipient's good health. There's the introduction to the letter. For Peter, that's chapter 1, verses 3 to 12. After that opening greeting, there is usually an introduction in Greco-Roman letters, and the central themes of the letter are put forward. That's what happens here for 1 Peter. In this section, the author might offer a blessing or a prayer of thanksgiving. Even in non-Christian letters, an author might give thanks to some pagan deity. Now, Peter opens this section with praise, and he introduces the themes of suffering, holiness, and salvation. The body of the letter comes next, and for 1 Peter, that's 1:13 through 5:11. And this is where the main message is found. And in this section, it can be broken down even further for us. 1:13 through 2:10 is the start of the main section where the exhortations begin. 2:11 to 4:11 is the heart of the letter where Peter gives practical instruction. And he starts this section with dear friends or agapetoi, the same word that starts the next section. 4:12 to 5:11, that's the closing of the main body of the letter. And this section recapitulates earlier points in the letter, and it offers some final motivational comments and reminders. And then the conclusion, 5:12 through 14. That's the section that contains those final greetings and sometimes even a final prayer. Now, Peter offers his final prayer of blessing in 5:11 before his closing greetings, which he does in verses 13 and 14.